Captain Jake Miller hated ice moons. The cold seeped through ship hulls, froze your equipment, and made every breath feel like inhaling knives. But patrol duty on Thurus 7 paid the bills, so there he was, scanning endless white nothing for the third week in a row. His coffee had gone cold again when the proximity alarm started screaming. A ship signature, faint and failing, about 2 clicks west. Jake sighed and changed course. Probably another idiot who'd tried to cut through the ice fields and learned why that was a bad idea. The wreckage was worse than he expected. The transport vessel had carved a trench half a mile long through the frozen surface before slamming into a cliff face. Black market registry, no distress beacon, cargo holds ripped open. Smugglers, then. Jake almost turned around right there. Smugglers meant trouble, and he'd had enough trouble to last a lifetime. But something made him land anyway. Maybe curiosity. Maybe boredom. Maybe the fact that his senses were picking up faint life signs in the wreckage, which meant someone might still be alive in there. Jake suited up and trudged through knee-deep snow toward the crash site. The cargo hold was torn open like a tin can, containers scattered everywhere. Most were empty. Some had shattered, their contents frozen solid and worthless. But one container in the back was still humming with power, its heating coils glowing a dull red. He pried it open, and his heart stopped. 3 dragon hatchlings lay inside, barely moving. Jake had seen dragons before, but only in military footage and security briefings. They were supposed to be massive, terrifying, covered in scales that could deflect plasma rounds. These things were tiny, fragile. The biggest was maybe the size of a medium dog. Their scales should have been shimmering and bright, but they looked dull, almost gray. Like the life was draining right out of them. Dragons were supposed to be fire breathers, right? So why were they freezing to death? The smallest one opened its eyes and looked at Jake. Really looked at him. There was intelligence there, awareness. It made a sound, soft and broken, like wind chimes in a winter storm. Then its eyes started to close again. Jake knew the regulations by heart. Dragons were classified as Category 5 bioweapons. Dangerous. Uncontrollable. If you found one, you called it in and kept your distance. You definitely didn't touch them. The last person who tried to bond with a dragon had been found frozen solid, every drop of moisture in their body turned to ice. But Jake was looking at 3 dying babies, and regulations suddenly seemed like something written by people who'd never had to make a real choice. He stripped off his thermal jacket and wrapped it around the smallest hatchling. The creature was so cold it burned his hands. He grabbed the other 2, tucking them against his chest, and ran back to his ship as fast as the snow would let him. Inside the Wayfarer, Jake's hands shook as he worked. He'd never tried to save a dragon before. Hell, he wasn't even sure what dragons needed to survive. But they were cold, and cold things needed heat, so he started there. He tore apart his ship's secondary heating system, rigging a makeshift incubator in the cargo bay. It wasn't pretty, and it definitely voided his ship's warranty, but it pumped out heat. He cranked the temperature up until his own skin was slick with sweat, then higher still. The hatchlings weren't responding. Their breathing was shallow, their scales still that awful gray color. Jake grabbed his emergency medical kit, the one designed for humans, and started doing what he could. He cleaned their wounds with antiseptic that probably wasn't meant for dragon skin. He used surgical tape to bind a gash on the biggest one's wing. He dripped water into their mouths with a medicine dropper, hoping they wouldn't choke. Hours passed. Jake's entire body ached from the heat and the stress. He was burning through fuel reserves that would cost him a month's salary to replace. He should stop. He should call this in and let the professionals handle it. Then the smallest hatchling moved. It crawled across the cargo bay floor, slow and shaky, until it reached Jake. Then it climbed into his lap, curled up, and wrapped its tail around his wrist. The moment they touched, Jake felt something weird. A warmth that didn't come from the heaters, spreading up his arm and into his chest. Not painful, just strange. Like the dragon was sharing its body heat with him, or maybe taking his. He couldn't tell which. The other 2 hatchlings noticed. They dragged themselves over and pressed against Jake's sides. And slowly, so slowly he almost missed it, their scales started to change. The gray faded. Color returned. Pale blue for the smallest one. Ice white for the medium-sized one. Silver for the biggest. Jake sat there on the floor of his cargo bay, surrounded by 3 baby dragons, and realized he just made a decision that was going to change everything. He didn't have clearance to keep dragons. He didn't have the equipment to raise them. He definitely didn't have permission to form whatever this weird connection was that he could feel growing stronger with every passing minute. But the smallest dragon was purring now, a sound like distant thunder, and Jake found himself gently stroking its head. Its scales were warming under his touch, becoming smooth and almost soft. He needed names for them. Couldn't just keep calling them the dragons. The smallest one, curled in his lap with its blue-tinted scales catching the light, he named Ember. The medium one, pure white and already showing signs of attitude, became Frost. The biggest, with silver scales that seemed to shimmer, he called Crystal. By the time morning came, all three hatchlings were breathing normally. They were eating the protein rations Jake had mashed up for them. They were fighting over the warmest spot in the incubator. They were alive. Jake stood at the pilot's controls, looking at the course back to the station. He should report this. Turn them over to the proper authorities. Follow the rules. Ember chirped from the cargo bay, and Jake felt that strange warmth pulse through his chest again. He deleted the patrol report from his logs and set course for the station. But he wasn't planning to follow any rules. Not anymore. Jake knew something was wrong the moment he docked at Frontier Station Delta. There were too many security personnel on the landing platform. Way too many. And they were all staring at his ship like it was about to explode. He'd barely opened the airlock when Agent Davis pushed his way inside, followed by 6 armed guards. Davis was a tall guy with a permanent scowl and the kind of attitude that suggested he'd never been told no in his entire life. "Captain Miller," Davis said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We received an automated distress signal from a crashed vessel on Thuros 7. Your patrol route. You filed no report. Care to explain?" Jake's mind raced. The smuggler ship must have sent out an emergency beacon before it went down. And now he had about 30 seconds to come up with a story that wouldn't get him arrested. Before he could answer, Ember poked her head around the corner from the cargo bay. She'd grown in just 2 days. Already the size of a large dog, her blue scales catching the station lights and making them shimmer like water. Every gun in the room swung toward her. "Stand down," Davis barked at his team, but his hand was on his own weapon. "Miller, you have a Category 5 sentient on your vessel. That's a felony violation of at least 15 galactic codes." "They were dying," Jake said simply. "I saved them." "Them?" Davis's eyes went wide. That's when Frost and Crystal decided to investigate the commotion. They bounded into the main cabin like oversized puppies, curious about the strangers. Crystal made a happy chirping sound. Frost started sniffing one of the guard's boots. "Dear God," Davis breathed. 3 of them. "Miller, do you have any idea what you've done?" Dragons are classified as bioweapons. They are aggressive, territorial, and they bond through a process that's killed every human who's attempted it. The last person who tried to raise a dragon was found frozen solid in their own ship. Jake crossed his arms. "These 3 seem pretty friendly to me. For now. Until they mature and their instincts kick in. Then they'll either kill you or die trying to defend you from perceived threats. Either way, people end up dead." Davis pulled out a tablet. "I'm authorized to seize them for transport to a xenobiology research facility. They'll be studied, kept in controlled conditions, and eventually relocated to a sanctuary world." "No." The word came out harder than Jake intended. Davis looked up from his tablet, surprised. "That wasn't a request, Captain." "I said no." The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. The guards shifted nervously. Their training said dragons were dangerous, but these 3 were currently playing with a loose bolt they'd found on the floor, rolling it between them like it was the most fascinating thing in the universe. Then Ember sensed Jake's stress. He felt it through that weird connection, the bond that had been growing stronger every day. His heart rate spiked, his body temperature rose slightly, and Ember responded instantly. She positioned herself between Jake and the agents, her small body rigid. Frost and Crystal immediately flanked her. All 3 of them made a sound Jake had never heard before, a low harmonic hum that made his teeth ache. The temperature in the cabin dropped 10 degrees in about 5 seconds. "Stand down," Davis ordered his team as they raised their weapons. "Nobody fire. Miller, control them." "I'm not controlling anything," Jake said, watching the dragons. "They're protecting me." That's when things got worse. Crystal, sensing the weapons as threats, exhaled. Not fire, like the old vids showed. A blast of supercooled air that flash froze Agent Davis's boots to the deck plating. Ice spread across the floor in geometric patterns, beautiful and terrifying. Alarms started blaring throughout the docking bay. Other ships began emergency undocking procedures. Someone was screaming about hull breaches and temperature warnings. "Cease fire." A new voice cut through the chaos. Dr. Rachel Bennett pushed through the crowd of security personnel, moving with the kind of authority that made armed guards step aside. She was the station's head of xenobiology, and Jake had met her once at a boring safety briefing. Rachel walked right up to the dragons without hesitation. Ember growled, but Rachel didn't flinch. She pulled out a thermal scanner and waved it over all three hatchlings while everyone else watched in stunned silence. "Fascinating," she murmured, checking her readings. Then she turned to Davis. "Agent, these aren't standard dragons. These are firstborn." "Firstborn?" Davis was still trying to chip ice off his boots with a multitool. "The original genetic line. Before the military modifications, before the bioweapon programs. We thought they were extinct." Rachel looked at Jake with something like awe. "Captain Miller, do you understand what you found?" "3 cold lizards that eat too much," Jake offered. Rachel almost smiled. "These dragons bond through thermal regulation. They're pack animals. They share body heat with family members, create temperature networks across entire groups. To them, your constant human body temperature marks you as kin. As family. So the bond everyone keeps warning me about has already happened. It started the moment you warned them." Rachel's expression turned serious. "And here's the problem. Firstborn bonds are permanent. If you separate from these hatchlings now, they'll stop regulating their own temperature. They'll freeze themselves to death within a week, maybe less. It's a survival mechanism gone wrong. They literally can't live without their bonded family." The cargo bay went quiet except for the hum of station machinery. Ember had relaxed slightly, but she was still pressed against Jake's leg, her tail wrapped around his ankle. Davis shook his head. "Doesn't matter. The law is clear. Dragons can't be privately owned, regardless of the circumstances." "Then change the law," Jake said. "I don't have that authority." "Then find someone who does, because I'm not giving them up." Davis looked at Jake like he'd lost his mind. "Captain, if you refuse to comply, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest and seize the animals by force." Rachel stepped between them. "If you try to take them by force, they'll defend their bonded human. People will die. Probably a lot of people." She gestured at the frozen deck plating. "They're babies, Agent Davis. Imagine what they'll be capable of in 6 months." Davis ran a hand through his hair, clearly out of his depth. He looked at the dragons, at Jake, at the growing crowd of onlookers filming everything on their personal devices. This was becoming a public relations nightmare. 24 hours, Davis finally said. "I need to contact my superiors, get guidance on this situation. Miller, you and those creatures don't leave this ship. If I even think you're trying to run, I'll lock down the entire station." Jake nodded. It wasn't much, but it was time. After everyone left, Rachel lingered in the doorway. "You know he's going to order them seized, right? Once the higher-ups weigh in, they'll want those dragons for research. Or worse." "I know. So what are you going to do?" Jake looked at Ember, Frost, and Crystal. They'd gone back to playing with the bolt, completely oblivious to the fact that they just caused an interstellar incident. Ember looked up at him and chirped happily. "I'm going to run," Jake said quietly. "Burn every bridge I've got and disappear into the outer reaches. Because you're right. These aren't weapons. They're family. And I don't abandon family." Rachel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "The security override for Bay 7's docking clamps is 4-7-7-2. The shift change happens at 0600 hours. Purely hypothetical information, you understand." She left before Jake could thank her. He had 14 hours to prep the ship, plot a jump course to somewhere the enforcement agency couldn't follow, and say goodbye to the only life he'd ever known. His military career was over. His pension, his benefits, his reputation, all gone. Ember climbed into his lap, purring that thunder sound. Worth it, Jake thought. Completely worth it. SF. The outer reaches smelled like rust and desperation. Jake had been hauling freight for 3 months now, barely making enough credits to keep the Wayfarer fueled and the dragons fed. And holy hell, could they eat? Ember had tripled in size. She was now roughly the size of a small horse, her blue scales shimmering with an iridescent quality that caught light in impossible ways. Frost had grown even bigger, pure white and sleek, with an attitude that reminded Jake of every stubborn cat he'd ever met. Crystal, the largest, had developed silver scales that looked like polished metal and a tendency to investigate everything with her teeth first. They weren't the tiny, helpless hatchlings he'd rescued anymore. They were becoming something magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Jake learned quickly that every assumption the galaxy had about dragons was wrong. They didn't breathe fire. The first time a drunk dock worker had gotten aggressive at a refueling station, Frost had exhaled in his direction. The guy's jacket had flash-frozen solid. So had the puddle of spilled fuel under his feet. The man had screamed and run, spreading stories about ice dragons that made station managers nervous whenever Jake requested docking permission. The communication thing had been the biggest surprise. Dragons didn't roar or growl like the military footage showed. They spoke through temperature. Jake had figured it out by accident when Ember had pressed her snout against his palm. Warmth pulsed through his hand, gentle and rhythmic. She was happy. When Frost detected a faulty power coupling in the engine room, she touched Jake's shoulder and flooded him with cold. Danger. Crystal's rapid temperature fluctuations meant curiosity, usually right before she tried to dismantle something expensive. Living with them was like having 3 extremely intelligent, extremely destructive toddlers with superpowers. Jake had taken a cargo run to a mining colony called Shepherd's Rest. Simple job. Pick up refined metals, drop them at a processing station 2 systems over. Easy money. He'd left the dragons in the ship with strict instructions not to touch anything. He came back to find Crystal had somehow opened a locked storage container and was organizing his tools by size and shininess. Frost had rewired the navigation computer because she didn't like the way it beeped. And Ember had built a nest out of reflective thermal blankets in the middle of the cargo bay. We talked about this, Jake said, exhausted. No nesting in the cargo area. That's where the paying cargo goes. Ember looked at him with those intelligent eyes and made a sound like wind through ice caves. She'd been practicing human speech, though her voice was still more atmosphere than words. Whom? She managed. This whom? Jake's irritation melted. To them, the ship was home. The cargo bay was just another room. They didn't understand human concepts of work and money and cargo space. They understood warmth and family and shiny things that needed to be collected and protected. Okay, he sighed. But smaller nest. Deal? Ember's scales glowed warm. Agreement. The real test came 2 weeks later at a colony called Haven Point. Jake was helping unload medical supplies when the shooting started. Pirates. 3 of them, heavily armed, probably thinking a remote mining colony was an easy target. The colonists scattered. Jake dove behind a cargo container as plasma rounds scorched the air above his head. His pulse spiked. His body temperature jumped. And 3 dragons who'd been napping in the Wayfarer felt it through the bond. They came out of that ship like a winter storm given form. Frost hit the ground first, moving faster than something her size had any right to. She exhaled toward the nearest pirate, and his rifle turned white with frost. The metal shattered when he tried to fire it, pieces scattering across the ground. The pirate stared at his broken weapon in disbelief. Crystal landed next to Jake, positioning herself as a living shield. Her scales had hardened somehow, deflecting a plasma shot that should have melted through flesh. The bolt ricocheted harmlessly into the sky. Ember was the smallest, but she'd always been the smartest. She didn't attack. She circled around the pirates, dropping the temperature in a wide radius. Their breath came out in visible clouds. Their movement slowed. The moisture in the air crystallized into floating ice particles that caught the sunlight like diamonds. The pirates weren't stupid. They saw 3 dragons working in perfect coordination and decided whatever they were planning to steal wasn't worth it. They ran for their ship and jumped to hyperspace so fast they probably left scorch marks. Jake stood up slowly, his heart still pounding. The colonists emerged from cover, staring at the dragons with a mixture of fear and awe. Then a kid started crying. Maybe 5 years old, separated from her parents in the chaos. She was wearing a thin jacket, completely inadequate for the temperature drop Ember had caused. The girl was shivering, lips turning blue. Ember noticed immediately. She moved toward the child, and several colonists gasped. One man raised a weapon. But Ember just lowered herself to the ground and wrapped her body around the little girl, carefully regulating her body temperature. Jake felt it through the bond. Ember was sharing warmth, but precisely. Not too hot, not too cold. Just enough to stop the shivering. The kid stopped crying and pressed against the dragon's scales, which had gone soft and warm like sun-heated stone. The girl's mother ran over, terrified, but stopped when she saw her daughter wasn't in danger. The kid was actually giggling, running her small hands over Ember's scales. Pretty, the girl said. Dragon pretty. The mother looked at Jake, tears in her eyes. Thank you. All of you. Word spread fast after that. The human with the ice dragons who'd saved Haven Point. Other colonies started reaching out, asking if Jake and his crew could visit. Not for protection, just to see the dragons. to understand them. Jake took a job delivering supplies to a research outpost on a frozen moon. The scientists there were studying extremophile bacteria in the ice. They were fascinated by the dragons, especially when Frost demonstrated her ability to create complex ice structures by carefully controlling her breath. She made sculptures, geometric patterns that looked almost mathematical in their precision. "They are not weapons," one of the researchers said, watching Crystal gently warm a piece of equipment that had frozen overnight. "They're engineers. Artists. They understand thermodynamics on an instinctive level that we need computers to calculate." Jake had never thought about it that way. But watching his dragons interact with the world, he realized the galaxy had been seeing them all wrong. They weren't created to destroy. They'd been twisted into weapons by people who didn't understand what they really were. The dragons were creatures of temperature and harmony. They existed in the spaces between hot and cold, balancing extremes to create something stable. Something beautiful. One night, Jake was doing maintenance in the engine room when all three dragons squeezed themselves into the small space with him. They didn't need anything. They just wanted to be close. Ember rested her head on his shoulder. Frost curled around his feet. Crystal pressed against his back, all of them sharing warmth in the cold of space. Through the bond, Jake felt their contentment. Their trust. Their absolute certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. He'd lost everything to save them. His career, his reputation, his place in civilized space. He was a fugitive now, always looking over his shoulder, never staying in one place too long. But sitting there in that cramped engine room, surrounded by dragons who chose to be with him, Jake couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "We're family," he said quietly. Weird, illegal, probably doomed family. But family. Ember's scales pulsed warm. The dragon equivalent of a hug. Yeah, Jake thought. Worth every sacrifice. Jake first heard about biotech dynamics on a grainy news feed at a backwater fueling station. The corporate logo flashed across the screen, all chrome and sharp edges, while a polished spokesperson talked about their commitment to galactic security and advanced bioweapon research. The next story made his blood run cold. 3 firstborn dragons spotted in the outer reaches. Reward offered for information leading to their recovery. For scientific purposes, the spokesperson claimed. For the advancement of interspecies understanding. Jake knew better. Biotech didn't want to study the dragons. They wanted to crack them open and figure out how the bonding worked. Turn it into something they could control. Something they could sell. He deleted his ship's transponder data and jumped to a new sector that same hour. The woman hunting them was named Dr. Lisa Morgan. Jake learned about her from a sympathetic dock worker who'd seen the corporate bulletins. Morgan had lost her younger brother 5 years ago when a military dragon went rogue during a training exercise. The dragon had been poorly bonded, unstable, and it had killed 6 people before it was put down. Her brother had been one of them. Since then, Morgan had dedicated her life to proving that dragons were too dangerous to exist outside of strict corporate or military control. She'd written papers, given speeches, climbed the ranks at biotech until she had the resources to back up her beliefs. And now she had a personal mission. Find the firstborn. Secure them. Make sure no one else lost family to an uncontrolled dragon. Jake might have felt sorry for her if she wasn't trying to take away his family. They ran for 6 weeks. Jake plotted jumps through rarely used hyperspace lanes, took jobs that paid under the table, and avoided any station with decent security. The dragon sensed his constant stress through the bond. It was making them anxious, aggressive. Frost snapped at a fuel tech who moved too quickly near Jake. Crystal growled at shadows. Ember stayed pressed against Jake's side almost constantly, her scales fluctuating between hot and cold as she tried to process his fear. The breaking point came at a repair station called Dusty's Last Chance. Jake needed a new power regulator, and Dusty was one of the few mechanics in 3 sectors who didn't ask questions. Jake had left the dragons in the ship with the cargo bay doors sealed. He was negotiating price when Dusty's assistant, a kid named Tommy who couldn't have been more than 19, walked up behind Jake and tapped his shoulder. Just a tap. Nothing threatening. The kid probably wanted to ask about part specifications. But Jake was running on 4 hours of sleep and a month and a half of looking over his shoulder. He spun around fast, his heart rate spiking, adrenaline flooding his system. Through the bond, Frost felt it. Danger. Threat. Protect. She was through the cargo bay door before Jake could stop her. 2 tons of dragon moving with predatory speed, heading straight for Tommy. Her jaw opened, supercooled air building in her throat. Frost, no. Jake screamed. She stopped. Inches from the kid. Her breath had already frozen the moisture in the air around Tommy's head, creating a halo of ice crystals. The kid was crying, too terrified to move. Frost looked at Jake, confused. Threat? Not threat? Her entire body was rigid with the need to protect, but Jake's command held her back. Stand down, Jake said, forcing his voice calm even though his hands were shaking. He's safe. He's a friend. Frost backed away slowly, but the damage was done. Someone had recorded it on their personal device. By the time Jake got the Wayfarer into space, the video had spread across 6 systems. Rogue dragons attack civilian. Uncontrolled firstborn pose public threat. Biotech offers sanctuary for dangerous dragons. The comments were worse. People saying the dragons should be destroyed. Others saying Jake was a criminal endangering innocent lives. A few defending him, but they were drowned out by the fear and anger. Jake sat in the pilot's chair, watching the feed scroll past, and felt like he was drowning. Frost pressed against his leg, whimpering. She knew she'd done something wrong, even if she didn't understand what. It's not your fault, Jake told her, scratching behind her jaw ridges. I'm the one who's messed up. Can't keep doing this to you. But he didn't know how to stop. Running was the only option. Until it wasn't. The really strange things started happening 3 days after the incident. Jake woke up from a nightmare about Morgan's ships surrounding him, and found Ember pressed against his forehead. Her scales were unusually warm, almost hot. Then he saw things. Images. Memories that weren't his own. A planet covered in cities made of ice and crystal. Dragons flying in formation with beings Jake didn't recognize, some humanoid, some decidedly not. Children playing in streets where the temperature shifted from one zone to another, and the dragons regulated the climate to keep everyone comfortable. This was Draktheon Prime. The dragon homeworld, before the mining corporations had stripped it bare. Ember pulled back, and the visions faded. Jake blinked, his head spinning. Did you just show me your memories? Ember's scales pulsed warm. Yes. Over the next week, all 3 dragons started sharing fragments of their genetic memory. Things they shouldn't have been able to know, but did. The history of their species, passed down through generations in thermal patterns and temperature sequences. Jake learned that dragons had never been weapons. They'd been guardians. Peacekeepers. They bonded with other species to create thermal networks across entire cities, regulating temperature extremes and making hostile worlds livable. They'd been artists and architects, building structures that worked with heat and cold instead of fighting against them. Then the wars came. Some species saw the dragon's bonding ability and wanted to weaponize it. They captured dragons, tortured them, broke their minds until the protective instinct became twisted into pure aggression. They bred dragons for war, stripping away everything gentle and leaving only the violence. The firstborn were the ones who'd escaped. The ones who'd hidden. The ones who remembered what they were supposed to be. Crystal showed Jake the worst memory. The final days of Draktheon Prime, when corporate mining ships had descended like locusts. The dragons had tried to defend their world, but there were too few of them. The corporations had superior weapons, superior numbers. The planet was stripped in less than a year, its ice cities melted and harvested, its crystal formations ground to dust. The surviving dragons scattered. Most were captured and entered into breeding programs. The firstborn bloodline was thought extinct. Until 3 hatchlings ended up in a smuggler's cargo hold on an ice moon, waiting to die. Jake understood then what he was really protecting. Not just 3 dragons. The memory of an entire civilization. The possibility that dragons could be something other than weapons again. But Morgan was getting closer. Her ships had been spotted in nearby sectors. She had resources Jake couldn't match, technology he couldn't outrun forever. He was sitting in the cargo bay, trying to figure out their next move, when his comm system lit up. Incoming message, encrypted, from an unknown source. Jake hesitated, then opened it. Dr. Rachel Bennett's face appeared on the screen. The xenobiologist from Frontier Station Delta, the one who'd helped him escape. Jake, I don't have much time. Biotech knows where you are. Morgan's fleet is 3 jumps out, maybe less. She's got authorization to use lethal force if you resist. Rachel's expression was grim. But there's something you need to know. She's not just after the dragons. She's after you too. Biotech wants to study the bond, and they need the bonded human alive to do it. You're both the prisoner and the bait. The transmission cut out. Jake looked at Ember, Frost, and Crystal. They'd grown so much. Ember was almost as big as Frost now. Crystal's scales had developed patterns that looked like circuitry. They were strong, intelligent, capable of devastating violence when threatened. But they were still his family. Still the scared hatchlings he'd wrapped in his jacket and carried through the snow. "Okay," Jake said quietly. "No more running. If Morgan wants us, she's going to have to come get us. And we're going to show her exactly what firstborn dragons can really do." Jake chose the abandoned colony of New Providence for their final stand. It wasn't strategic genius, just desperation. The colony had been evacuated 15 years ago after the primary water source dried up, leaving behind empty buildings and dusty streets. But a group of refugees had moved in recently, people with nowhere else to go. Families who couldn't afford passage to better worlds. Jake had been helping them, running supply deliveries at cost, sometimes for free. It wasn't much, but it was something. Now those same people were about to become collateral damage in a corporate hunt. Dr. Morgan's fleet appeared in orbit exactly when Rachel said they would. 12 ships, all bearing the biotech logo. Destroyers, mostly. Way more firepower than you'd need to capture 3 dragons and 1 desperate pilot. The comm system crackled to life. Morgan's face filled the screen. She looked tired, older than her file photos. Like someone who'd been chasing ghosts for too long. "Captain Miller," she said. Her voice was flat, professional. "You know why I'm here?" "Yeah," Jake replied. "You want my family. I want dangerous bioweapons secured before more people get hurt. There's a difference." Morgan's jaw tightened. "I've seen the footage from Dusty Station. That dragon nearly killed a teenager. How long before your control slips completely? How long before they kill someone you can't stop them from killing?" Jake looked at Frost, who was lying beside his chair. She'd been miserable since the incident, barely eating. Dragons felt guilt, he'd learned. They felt shame. "She was protecting me," Jake said. "It was my fault, not hers. It's always someone's fault until people are dead. Then fault doesn't matter." Morgan leaned forward. "I'm offering you a choice. Surrender the dragons voluntarily. They'll be taken to a secure research facility where they'll be studied humanely. You'll face charges, but I'll recommend leniency. Or you can refuse, and I'll order my ships to glass this entire settlement. Every building. Every person hiding in those ruins. Their blood will be on your hands, not mine." The comm feed switched to external cameras. Jake saw families huddled in doorways. Kids clutching makeshift toys. Old folks who'd survived too much already to die because of someone else's war. 237 people. He'd counted them during his last supply run. "You've got 10 minutes, Morgan said, and cut the transmission." Jake sat in silence. Through the bond, he felt the dragon's emotions. Ember's confusion. Crystal's growing anger. Frost's deep, terrible guilt. They didn't understand ultimatums or politics. They just knew their family was in danger. "We can fight," Crystal said. Her human speech had gotten better over the months. Still sounded like gravel in a blender, but understandable. "We can win." Jake believed her. The dragons were massive now, powerful. They could probably take down half those ships before the fleet knew what hit them. But the other half would fire on the colony. People would die. Lots of people. "There has to be another way," Jake muttered. That's when Ember pressed her forehead to his. The thermal contact was intense, almost burning. And suddenly Jake was seeing things again. Not memories this time. Ember was showing him something else. Ancient wars. Dragons bonded to other species, fighting as perfect units. Unstoppable. They'd conquered half the galaxy before anyone figured out how to stop them. And they'd only been stopped when the bonded pairs started turning on each other, their combined aggression spiraling out of control until entire worlds burned. The bonds made them powerful. But the bonds also amplified everything. Love and rage. Protection and destruction. There was no middle ground when two species' emotions fed into each other like an endless loop. Ember pulled back, and Jake understood what she was trying to tell him. The bond was killing them all slowly. Not physically, but in every other way that mattered. He was making them too aggressive. His stress, his fear, his constant fight-or-flight responses were bleeding into them through the thermal connection. And their protective instincts were making him more paranoid, more isolated. They were trapped in a cycle that would eventually get everyone killed. Jake stood up and walked to the cargo bay where he'd set up the dragon's nesting area. All 3 of them followed him, concerned. He pulled out the tablet where he'd been storing Ember's thermal memories, the techniques the ancient dragons had used to bond and unbond with their partners. "I need you to trust me," Jake said. One more time. What he was about to attempt had never been done before, according to the records. dragons bonded for life. Breaking a bond was supposed to be impossible. But the ancient dragons had known something. They developed techniques to loosen the connection, to give both sides independence while maintaining respect and cooperation. It was the difference between being controlled and choosing to cooperate. Jake started with Ember because she understood best. He placed both hands on her scales and focused on the bond, that warm thread connecting them. Then he started deliberately cooling his own body temperature, disrupting the rhythm they'd fallen into. It hurt. Like tearing muscle. Like cutting away part of his own soul. Ember whimpered, but she didn't pull away. She understood what he was doing. Through the fading bond, Jake felt her start to regulate her own temperature independently. Not pulling from his warmth anymore. Creating her own. He did the same with Frost and Crystal. Each time it got a little easier and a lot more painful. By the time he finished, Jake was shaking, covered in sweat, feeling like he'd run a marathon in a furnace. The bond was still there. He could still sense the dragons, still feel their emotions. But it was quieter now. Less invasive. More like background music than a constant shout in his head. "How do you feel?" he asked them. "Different," Frost said slowly. "Colder. But clearer." "Good," Jake said. "Because we're about to do something really stupid, and I need you thinking for yourselves, not just reacting to my fear." He opened a comm channel to Morgan. "I'm coming out. The dragons are coming with me. But we're not surrendering." Morgan's ships were already in position when Jake walked into the settlement's main square. The dragons flanked him, moving with a coordination that no longer came from the bond but from genuine cooperation. The refugees had gathered to watch, probably figuring if they were going to die, they might as well see what happened first. Morgan's shuttle landed, and she stepped out with a dozen armed guards. She looked at the dragons, then at Jake, and her hand moved to her sidearm. "Last chance, Miller." "Watch," Jake said simply. He gave Frost a nod. She moved toward the nearest biotech guard, and every weapon swung toward her. But Frost didn't attack. She carefully, precisely, exhaled a stream of supercooled air at the guard's rifle. The weapon froze solid, but the guard's hands were fine. Frost had controlled the temperature so exactly that the metal froze while the man's skin stayed at normal temperature. Crystal did the same to 3 more guards. Not hurting them. Just disabling their weapons with surgical precision. Ember demonstrated something different. She approached one of Morgan's ships and placed her claws on the hull. Jake felt the temperature shift. Ember was creating a thermal map of the ship's interior, showing exactly where the crew was positioned, where the weak points were, where the power systems ran. Information that could save lives in a rescue operation or prevent collateral damage in a fight. The guards stared. The refugees stared. Morgan stared. "They're not weapons," Jake said. "They never were. They're problem solvers. Engineers. They understand heat and cold better than our best computers. They can freeze a weapon without hurting the person holding it. They can find survivors in collapsed buildings by tracking body heat. They can regulate climate on hostile worlds. They could save millions of lives if anyone bothered to see them as something other than monsters." One of the refugee kids, maybe 8 years old, broke away from her mother and ran toward Ember. The mother screamed. Guards raised their remaining weapons. But Ember just lowered herself to the ground and let the kid climb onto her back. The dragon's scales shifted to a comfortable warmth, and the kid laughed. "Pretty dragon," the girl said, same words as the kid at Haven Point. Morgan's weapon hand dropped to her side. Jake saw something crack in her expression. Maybe she was thinking about her brother. Maybe she was seeing dragons as something other than the creature that killed him. "This doesn't change anything," Morgan said, but her voice lacked conviction. "They are still classified as Category 5 threats." "Then change the classification," Jake said. "You've got the authority. You've seen what they can really do." A refugee stepped forward. Old guy named Pat who'd been a colony administrator before everything fell apart. He'd been recording the whole thing on a battered camera. "I'm sending this to every news outlet in 6 sectors, Pat announced. "People deserve to see the truth." Other refugees pulled out their devices. Suddenly there were dozens of cameras, all broadcasting live. Morgan's tactical advantage evaporated. She could still order an attack, but now the whole galaxy would watch. Would judge. Morgan looked at her guards, at the dragons, at the cameras. She was trapped by her own ultimatum and the court of public opinion. "Stand down," she told her team. Then she looked at Jake. "This isn't over." "I know," Jake said. "But it's a start." Morgan's fleet withdrew. Within hours, the footage went viral. News outlets picked it up. Scientists demanded reclassification. Politicians who'd been taking biotech money suddenly backed away from the corporation. Public opinion shifted like a landslide. 3 weeks later, the Galactic Council issued a new directive. Firstborn dragons were reclassified as sentient allies, not bioweapons. Bonding was legal under supervised conditions. Biotech Dynamics was sanctioned for unauthorized weapons research. Jake and the dragons established a settlement on a frozen moon called Crystalline. It was the perfect temperature for dragons, cold enough that they thrived. Other firstborn started appearing, freed from black market dealers and corporate labs. Survivors who'd been hiding for decades. The colony grew. Dragons and humans working together, not through forced bonds but through choice. Learning from each other. Building something new. One night, Jake sat outside his prefab shelter, watching ice crystals form in the air. Ember settled beside him, her scales glowing soft blue in the moonlight. The bond was still there, quieter but deeper. Not control. Partnership. "We did it," Jake said. "Changed the whole galaxy's mind about dragons." Ember's scales pulsed warm. But she wasn't responding to his emotion anymore. She was sharing her own. Pride. Contentment. Hope. And Jake realized the real truth. He hadn't rescued the dragons. By letting themselves be truly seen, by showing the galaxy what they really were, the dragons had rescued humanity from its own fear. From its need to control everything it didn't understand. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was trust someone different from yourself. And sometimes, that trust changed everything.